As the term goes, the nervous system. A system is made up of organs. Organs are made up of tissues, and tissues are made up of cells. I'm sure we saw that in grade 10. So here we're going to look at nerve cells. Which are the cells that are found or that make up the nervous system? Otherwise, we call them, simply put, neurons. These are specialized cells which connect the brain and the spinal cord to the rest of the body. That's why whatever we feel can be transferred to the brain and the spinal cord, because these nerve cells connect them. Now, these are the major parts that make up a neuron, otherwise a nerve cell. We'll have a cell body. We'll see it on the next slide. We'll see dendrites. We'll see axons. Point to notice, dendrites always carry impulses towards the cell body. Meanwhile, the axon always carries impulses away from the cell body. Okay. Now, this is then the structure of a neuron. Let us look at the structure of a neuron now in detail. The neuron at one point is made up of a cell body. That's how the cell body looks like. Or we can also call it the soma. We can call that the soma. The cell body is more or less like a typical animal cell as you know it. It has a nucleus inside of it. It has cytoplasm, just like animal cells that you know about, as cytoplasm. It then also has cytoplasmic inclusions like mitochondria, Golgi body, endoplasmic reticulum, lysosomes, etc. So it functions like a normal cell. Now, around the cytoplasm or around the cell body, we have cytoplasmic extensions. These are extensions radiating around the cell body. I want you to remember that. And these extensions are then what we call dendrites. One of such extension gets modified into a cylindrical structure that we'll then call the axon. This is the axon that has been extracted here. One of the extensions, one of the cytoplasmic extensions, modifies itself to form a bigger one that we call the axon, which looks much bigger than the dendrites, or the axon cylinder, because it's cylindrical in shape. Now, earlier, we were talking about the dendrites and the axon in the previous slide. We mentioned something. We said that impulses or dendrites carry impulses. We'll see they carry impulses towards the cell body, always carry impulses towards the cell body. That's what we're seeing here. Okay. Meanwhile, the axon carries impulses, we can see here, away from the cell body. You can see how the axon is taking impulses after all of them have been integrated here. The axon now takes the impulse away from the cell body. That's what it meant. Now, looking at the axon, we will notice some groups of cells around the axon. I have here one, another one, another one. These cells are referred to as neuro for neuron, glial cells, or we can simply call them glial cells. And these glial cells, one example of them is the Schwann cell. These cells are just for support. They're around the axon for support and for maintenance. If the axon sustains an injury, it is the cells that fix them. So these cells are just clustered around the axon such that they will always leave some space to form nodes of Ranvier around the axon. We have nodes of Ranvier around the axon. Now, these cells, the neuroglial cells or the glial cells, they produce some kind of fatty substance made up of fat around the axon. And this substance that they produce around the axon, which is made up of fat, is what we call myelin. Myelin around the axon. This is the fat that they produce. The substance is made up of myelin, such that the whole axon will be fitting inside this fat substance all around it, myelin. Just as how a sword, my sword here, this is my axon, the myelin into which the sword is going to fit, such that my axon fits inside the myelin just like a sword fits inside its sheath. So I'm sheathing the sword. That's why we call this layer a myelin sheath. A sheath made up of myelin, such that the axon goes inside there. So it forms a myelin sheath, a layer of fat that forms a sheath around the axon. Now, what then is the function of this layer of fat? Fat is an insulator, otherwise the opposite of a conductor. Conductors are materials that allow heat and electricity to pass through them, moving from one point to another. Insulators are the opposite. They don't allow heat and electricity, like plastic, for example, wouldn't allow heat and electricity to pass through. The scenario with the axon and the myelin sheath is the same scenario we see with electric cables. The copper wiring inside the electric cable is the axon, and the plastic around the electric cable outside the copper wiring is the myelin sheath, for example. And inside there, inside the axon, there is a message or information that flows right through it, just like electricity flows inside the copper. That information is what we call an impulse. And impulses are electrochemical messages that flow inside the neurons. Now, what is then the function of the plastic around the electric cable, or that form parts of the electric cable? The function of the plastic is to serve as an insulator. That's why you can hold an electric cable which is powered up without getting shocked, because it acts as an insulator. It doesn't allow electricity to pass through it to get to your hand. The myelin sheath functions the same way. It keeps the impulse, which is electrical, while it is passing through the axon. It keeps the impulse within the axon without it escaping the axon, because it cannot escape through that layer of insulation, such that the amount of the impulse is always kept the same, and it will then always travel in all its intensity without losing any part of it. In that way, the impulse will always travel very fast in terms of milliseconds. So if then you were to be asked the function of the myelin sheath, it will be to speed up the impulse, because it keeps the whole integrity of the impulse within the axon, since the myelin sheath is not a conductor. So That will be the function of the myelin sheath, to keep the impulse, because it is an insulator, keep the impulse within the axon such that it travels always at full speed. I think I've exhausted everything here. Those are the detailed structure of the axon. We'll see at the end of the axon we have what we call terminal dendrites. That is the part where the one neuron makes contact with another neuron, but not a physical contact, because in between the neurons there is some kind of space, a gap that occurs in between the neurons. That's another neuron generating there. Yeah, that's another neuron that's making contact with my first neuron. And this space here is what we call a synapse. We'll talk about it as we move on in other sections. It's what we call a synapse. And we'll see what happens at the level of the synapse in detail as well. So, just a recap of what we were explaining earlier. We have myelinated axons and dendrites, which are fatty and they are wrapped around them and act as insulation. I explained that already. Now, when we look at a nerve is simply a bundle of atoms to form a nerve fiber. So in one nerve fiber, we have many neurons, many axons that are passing through there. Okay, these are bundles. A bundle of neuron forms a nerve. There are then three major types of neurons. There are sensory neurons. The first one here is a typical sensory neuron. There are motor neurons, that's the second one. And interneuron, you'll see it's found in between these other two, the interneuron. Okay, it's found in between these other two. Otherwise, it's also called the connector neuron because it connects these two neurons, or also called the relay neuron because it relays impulses between these two neurons. So sensory, inter, and motor neuron. Now, the interneuron is only found within the central nervous system. It means you only find it either in the brain or in the spinal cord, never in the periphery. It means that the sensory neuron and the motor neuron are peripheral neurons because they are found in the periphery. So please note that, because you might be asked the question, which neuron is found exclusively in the central nervous system? Your answer will be the interneuron or connector neuron or relay neuron. That will be your answer. We can then look at their detailed functions. The sensory neuron is also called the afferent neuron. Remember when I was talking about the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord, I mentioned about two roots. One root was going up from all parts of the body towards the central nervous system. Okay, and that root was the afferent. It means our sensory neuron is just there at the afferent root. That's our sensory neuron. So that's why it's also called afferent neuron. So they carry impulses towards the central nervous system. It is either unipolar or bipolar. We'll see what it means. And they are sensitive to stimuli in the environment. We talked about what stimuli are. These are events that bring about the response. And when we say they are sensitive to stimuli in the environment, it means it is the sensory neurons which are found in sense organs that pick up changes in the environment that pick up different forms of stimuli in the environment, convert this information, the stimuli, to impulses and send them towards the central nervous system, passing through the afferent route. Now, the connector neuron comes second in place. When the impulse has reached the central nervous system, the connector neuron is found there in the central nervous system. It then receives the impulse from the sense organs, more precisely from the sensory neuron. It is always multipolar. We'll look at what it means. It will then integrate or analyze the information. I mentioned this before when I explained to you how the nervous system functions. It picks up changes in the environment, sends in the form of information. The information is integrated and analyzed, and a response is being formulated. So the connector neuron will then effect a response or formulate that response. Next is the motor neuron. The impulse is passed down from sensory to connector. When everything is done, analysis, formulation, and effect of response, the motor neuron picks up the impulse from the connector neuron. And it will then direct it to the rest of the body, passing through the efferent route. That's why we also call it the efferent neuron. Remember, the sensory is afferent, the motor is efferent. Efferent route takes down from the CNS to the body. With the afferent, we are going up. With the efferent, we are coming back down from the CNS. Up to the CNS, down from the CNS, efferent. So the efferent neuron is the motor neuron. It carries impulses, like earlier explained, from the central nervous system, and it is also always multipolar, just like the connector neuron. They are always multipolar. Notice that it is only the sensory is never multipolar. It is either unipolar or bipolar. And it also affects the response. It takes the response back down to what we call the effector, where the action is going to be executed. The effector could either be a gland or muscle. Now we can decide about the polarity of neurons. And neurons will then be classified into three categories, either as unipolar, uni means one, bipolar, bi means two, or multipolar, multi means many. Okay, so neurons could either be unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar. Now, how do we decide on the polarity of these neurons? It's very simple. We'll be looking at the cell body as our start point. We then ask ourselves the simple question: how many cytoplasmic extensions? I asked you in a previous slide to remember the word cytoplasmic extension. How many cytoplasmic extensions are directly connected to the cell body, making direct contact with the cell body? That's a question we ask ourselves. How many of such are there? In this case here, if we are to count with this particular neuron, we'll see that making direct contact with the cell body, that's here, we will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we're taking inclusively with the axon itself, because it's one of the cytoplasmic extensions, just as the dendrites. So here I have 9 cytoplasmic extensions directly touching the cell body. The moment I started counting from 1 and I got to 3, 3 is already many. So that's why with 9 cytoplasmic extensions, this neuron will be a multipolar neuron. And this is an example of a motor neuron. Looking at the second neuron here, first we identify the cell body and we ask ourselves how many cytoplasmic extensions are directly touching this cell body. I will have here 1 and 2. 2 is bi, so this neuron will be a bipolar neuron, and this is an example of a sensory neuron. Then I will have here another one again, the third neuron down, number of cytoplasmic extensions that are directly, check here, be very careful with this one, this is our cell body here. So when I look at the cell body, the number of cytoplasmic extension that makes direct contact with this cell body is just 1. This is the only one here. And 1 is mono or uni. Hence, this neuron will be a unipolar neuron. It's written here pseudo-unipolar neuron because it's a kind of false unipolar neuron. It's false uni. That's why here it looks as if it wants to divide into 2, but the actual contact is made only by 1 cytoplasmic extension, so it's unipolar. If we then look at the neurons here, we should then be able to identify the different types of neurons based on polarity. I'll be having here, this will be multipolar with many cytoplasmic extensions. This is a motor neuron. This will be bipolar, 2 cytoplasmic extensions. This is a sensory neuron. I'll have here unipolar with just 1 cytoplasmic extension. This is another type of sensory neuron. So you'll see I already have 2 types of sensory neurons. And again, this is the cell body here, so don't get mixed up because you see many branches somewhere here. This is a cell body here with only 1 extension touching it. Again, this is another unipolar neuron. Again, another type of sensory neuron. And right up here, we have a neuron with how many cytoplasmic extensions? So many, because this is a cell body. Hence, this is a multipolar neuron. This is the example of a connector neuron or an interneuron or relay neuron. So that's how you determine the polarity of neurons. Reflex arc